Welcome to Turrican!
As many people are aware, many of the home computers of the late 80s and early 90s, such as the Commodore Amiga and Atari ST, weren't as popular over here in the United States as they were in Europe, so games for such systems were often overlooked. However, many home computer games of the time were ported over to the home consoles. Despite this, very few of these ports were as good as the original versions. Turrican is a great example of this. The Genesis version of the original Turrican suffers from an extremely oversensitive health bar, shoddy collision detection, exponentially greater enemies, and the port itself is overall way too fast. In all honesty, I think that this port was designed for the European Mega Drive's 50 frames per second, as opposed to the 60 frames per second on North American systems, but no further adjustments were made when bringing the game over to the States. At least that's my theory. At least the Game Boy version is decent. The Turrican 2 ports, on the other hand, were coded better, but someone at Accolade, the company that handled the Turrican console ports, decided that it'd be best if they swapped Brendan McGuire with Jean-Claude Van Damme. The bosses with vaguely more Earth-like counterparts switched around the order of the levels, messing up the logical stage progression in the process, and replaced the spaceship levels with 3 awful ground stages scattered randomly throughout the game's duration. Thus, we have the hilarious mess that is Universal Soldier. Needless to say, it's a guilty pleasure of mine, but it's frightfully apparent that Turrican was lacking a good console translation at the time. Though, I will say that it is nice to hear Turrican 2 music on the Genesis. Originally, Factor 5 wanted to handle the conversions for the games, but that offer was turned down. However, after Turrican 2's success, Factor 5 gained control of the series and started to focus more on the home consoles of the time. Thus brings in Super Turrican on the... Excuse me, I appear to be holding the wrong game. Yes, this is the NES game of the same name. This is the last finished official Turrican game with Manfred Trentz's involvement. In fact, he made this game all by himself. Graphics, music, programming, level design, everything. So yeah, this is going to be a 2 reviews in 1 kind of thing. I'll talk about the Super Nintendo game in a second, and I know I'm kind of cheating here, but hey, when else am I going to talk about this one? Unlike its Super Nintendo counterpart, it was only released in Europe. However, it will work on a North American NTSC NES just fine, and it will even work on clones like the FC Twin belonging to such a region as well. The graphics are surprisingly good for the NES, with detailed and varied tile sets, smooth animation, and so on. The sound, on the other hand, is a mixed bag. The sound effects all fit their corresponding actions just fine and are nice to listen to, but the music can get ear-grating sometimes. However, that's only sometimes. A few of Chris Hulsbeck's Turrican songs have been ported here and do sound quite nice. Heck, even some of Marcus Seibold's songs from Enforcer, another Manfred Trenz game on the Commodore 64, make an appearance here as well. That and the ending theme is bizarrely catchy. It's just that first level theme. More or less, the game is pretty much a remake of the first game. The environments are the same, and the level design generally follows that of the original, with some elements from Turrican 2, along with a few twists here and there, which is definitely welcome. Unfortunately, as far as gameplay goes, you're going to run into pretty much all of the game's problems within the first couple of minutes. While the controls are very responsive, the layout itself is a bit odd. At first it doesn't seem that way. B is to run and shoot, A is jump, directional buttons to move, but then you learn that down and start activates the gyroscope. Pressing start while standing still or running will switch to this strange spread gun that you can aim. This is essentially this game's equivalent of the power lines from the other games. Select is pause, and to unpause you don't press select again, you press A. While this isn't horrendous, I think the control scheme could have definitely been improved upon. In addition, if you die, you have to start the stage all over again. In the other Turrican games, you are beamed back to the safest place that's closest to where you died. This would be one thing if the game was easy, but this is one of the absolute hardest games in the whole series, so this is going to happen a lot. So yeah, when I first played this, I hated it. However, as I progressed further in the game, I start to like it more and more. The levels are big, there are plenty of secrets, the enemy placement is within reason, there's some good music here and there, the platforming is fun, there's plenty of variety, and the whole game you just have this big adrenaline rush. So once you get past this game's faults, it is pretty enjoyable. It's not the best NES game out there, but it's far from the worst. Now on to the Super Nintendo game. Much like the NES game, it follows the example set by Turrican 1 and 2. However, this game clearly has the big advantage of having a complete development team. Even with that though, the game has a bit of an odd development history. It was being developed alongside Mega Turrican, otherwise known as Turrican 3. As I mentioned in my review of that game, they spent a lot of 1992 just working on their development kits for the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. In fact, their Super Nintendo kits took longer to work out than their Genesis counterparts. Even though both games technically started development in late 1991, the development process hadn't truly begun until the summer of 1992. Unfortunately, they didn't have all the time in the world to work on this game, leaving them to cram the entire process into 3 short months. In addition to all of that, they were told that they had to cram the entire game into a 4 megabit cartridge, or in other words, 512 kilobytes. They finished the game as a 6 megabit game. This forced them to cut out an entire world of the game, the heat beam which would allow you to melt objects in the ice world, as well as several enemies. You can find more details on the whole process on Factor 5's website at factor5.de. With that kind of development process, you'd probably expect this game to be a total mess. And guess what? It's awesome! I'm going to be totally honest here. This is not only my favorite Super Nintendo game, it's my second favorite entry in the Turrican series. As to why, I'll get right to that. Let's start with the game's presentation, as customary as that course of action may be. This game looks gorgeous. This is one of the best looking Super Nintendo games I've ever seen. Yeah, it may not be as advanced as something like Rendering Ranger, which I'll definitely have to get to later, but my god, look at the color composition, look at the shading, look at the backgrounds, look at the contrast, just look at this game! So yeah, the game looks unbelievable, but what about the music? Well, despite most of the songs being quite short, as a majority of the soundtrack is composed of Super Nintendo versions of Turrican 3 songs, it sounds great too. This is one of the best sounding games on the system. Many people attribute this to the fact that this is one of the few Super Nintendo games to utilize Dolby Surround sound. Well, I definitely think that's a factor. I think a lot of that comes more so from the passion and drive being put into the songs themselves. You can tell that Chris Hulsbeck was just pouring his heart into some of these sequences, and it really, really shows. Regardless, this game's atmosphere and tone just totally blows me away, especially in stages like 1-3 and 3-1. So with that, what about the gameplay? Well, even though I absolutely adore this game, it isn't as artistic as Turrican 2, or even the other games in what is considered to be the Turrican trilogy. For one thing, the logical level progression is a tad bit off, as the transitions between the environments are often not present, and the game feels a little jumpy and fragmented as a result, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for a side-scroller of the time. It's just the logical level progression was a big part in what made Turrican work on an artistic level. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't other artistic things about it, or that every game needs to be artistic in order to be considered good. Plus, we do get a lot of variety in the game, so that makes up for it, at least on an entertainment level. Other than the level progression being a little strange, the core gameplay of Turrican remains largely intact. There's a lot of platforming, shooting, and exploring your environments. Now, did I mention the platforming? Okay, good, because there is a ton of platforming in this game. And it's very, very clear that the guys at Factor 5 want the platforming, as well as the game in general, to be as satisfying as humanly possible. The non-linear platforming is as fun as it sounds, and it's always rewarding to find new secrets that you didn't know about before, but there are even more things that make the game satisfying this time around. For example, most of the quick gimmicks the game throws at you are heavily environment-based, and they do a really good job of making the environment itself feel believable. Then there's the customary but always fun action of jumping on enemies. Of course, ever since Turrican 2, jumping on the walker enemies became a trope that remained present in every entry in the series after that point, even the spiritual successors in fan games. Why? Well, you know how satisfying it is to jump on a Goomba in Super Mario Bros.? Imagine that amplified exponentially, as not only do you crush the walker that you jump on, but afterwards it jumps up into the air, screams, runs into the nearest wall before exploding upon collision. Almost all of the enemies in this game are given similar twists, even the ones you couldn't jump on in previous entries. Something I love doing is timing my jump perfectly when bouncing off an enemy. That way I send myself bouncing much higher, or temporarily trapping myself in between an enemy and a ceiling, causing me to jump on the enemies rapidly. Plus, you have this freeze beam, which is really fun to abuse like mad. And when you've got that music going in the background, all of this is just unbelievably fun and satisfying. As a result of these extra interactions, the enemies themselves feel very tangible, very much like the environment itself. So again, there are some very strong things about the game. But yeah, the game as a whole isn't trying to be anything that special, it's more so just trying to be a really fun platformer. And it excels at that. In addition, it stays true to what made Turrican awesome in the first place, but also like Turrican 3, makes it more accessible to console gamers. It has more conventional health meter, more conventional jump controls, but otherwise demonstrates what makes the series so good. As a result of this, if you're looking for a good introduction to the series and are more accustomed to the conventions of console games of the time, this is most certainly for you. So if this game looks fun to you at all, I suggest playing it in whatever way you can and come to your own conclusions from there. As always, thanks for watching.